Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gaurav Padia, and I'm a director of the Canadian Club Toronto. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relations between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. We are grateful for the opportunity to be able to come together to learn on this land. Guests, thank you for joining us today. Over the past several years, society has taken great steps to address some of our historical inequities in business and beyond. Great efforts have been made to expand the diversity of boards of directors, executive teams, and senior leadership across industries. How has this challenge been met? What are the obstacles to success, and how do we overcome them? Our expert panel today will address these questions and more as they discuss what practices are working now and where do we still need to lean on to take DEI forward. Is that even the right term anymore? Just before we hear from today's panel, I want to review a few housekeeping instructions. Please take note of the following. To ask a question, click the Activity tab on the right-hand side of the video player and click the question button. These will be sent to the moderator. The Help button, located at the top right corner of the page, is for technical support if needed. I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, TD Bank, for helping to make this event possible, and thank you to our season sponsor, Canadian Bankers Association, for its continuing support. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 125 years, and it is because of our sponsors, partners, and members that we're able to do so. Thank you for your continued support. Now, to introduce today's speakers. Krystal Abotossaway, Senior Manager, HR Leadership Development Program, TD at TD, and President of the Aboriginal Professional Association of Canada. Michael Bach, author and IDEA thought leader and former director of Canadian Club Toronto. Julie Cafley, Executive Director, Catalyst Canada. Kike Ojo-Thompson, founder and CEO, KOJO Institute. Today's discussion will be moderated by Scott Belton, Senior Vice President, Canadian Personal Banking Strategy and Acquisition at TD, and a fellow club director. A tradition that our club maintains is to toast we make to our country. So if you have a beverage close by, please join me in a toast to Canada. Scott, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Gaurav, very much. I am really excited for this discussion today. The expertise and experience of our panelists is extraordinary, and really looking forward to jumping into this, I think, incredibly important topic. Maybe I start with you, Kike, and work on DEI in its various forms has been underway for a long time. What do you think is going well? What's something or some of the positive things you've seen over the years? And I'll remind my panelists, including Kike, to unmute themselves. Apologies.
When you're not used to being the one on mute. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you, Scott, for the question. What's going well? I think that we can all say definitively that this conversation has been normalized, sort of talking about this issue or this matter of equity, equity deserving groups, and sort of the frameworks to get to equity, like inclusion and anti-racism and anti-oppression. I mean, the language is around us, it's being normalized, and I think only good can come from that. So I would say that's sort of a big plus. The only thing I would add is that opportunities are being created. I think the sort of asterisk is, what do we do with those opportunities? So, but that's for another question.
And I guarantee we will come back to that question for sure. Krystal, same question. What's your view on maybe reason for optimism or something you've seen in your circles that's good?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple to name for sure. I think we're seeing a lot more board representation of racialized groups coming into different various sectors. We're also seeing Indigenous advisory councils that advise C-suite executives on reconciliation and what that means for their organizations. We're seeing a lot more attention in ESG reports on diversity and inclusion, I think. So just to name a few, those are wins in my view.
And I'm going to definitely take this question to everyone. So, Michael, your views on this question?
Yeah, I think I agree with the comments that Kike and Krystal have shared, that we have made progress. And I've been doing this work now for nearly 20 years. I think the conversation is it's there. It's at I was going to hesitate, but almost a fevered pitch that, we're talking about diversity a lot. I think there is more to do, but I think progress is being made. And I think personally that we are becoming a real shining example of this on the global stage. I read the Globe and Mail and the New York Times every day, and the number of articles in the Globe on this compared to the Times is remarkably different. How many articles appear in the Globe versus the Times?
That's really interesting. And Julie, round out the question for us. What are you seeing that's been good? What's your view on some positive progress that's taken place?
Absolutely. Well, I have a lot of concerns. I have an enormous amount of optimism. Catalyst Canada has been doing this work for the past 60 years, and there's a huge shift in terms of this being led by CEOs, being core to strategy, being led by the board of directors, actually seen as an institutional risk if it's not being taken seriously. So the game has been upped. It's not optional. It's not good intentions are frankly not enough. We're really turning to action, and we're really seeing a solid change. And I can't agree with my colleagues more. Canada is a shining example, but we can't get ahead of ourselves. We still have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of reasons for concern. But overall, we're seeing dedicated resources, we're seeing meaningful action, and we're seeing, frankly, a lot of authentic leadership around these issues.
Yeah, and that's great, Julie. And to foreshadow for the audience, part of the objective of today is for everybody who's interested to walk away with some tangible things they can do differently, or that this group feels needs to be done differently. So we will absolutely get to that. Julie, I'm going to come right back to you. A lot of this has to be rooted in fact and empirical data. And I'd love what is the research telling us? How do employees see the state of the world? I know it's a broad question, so feel free to take it wherever you want, but I'd love to share with the audience what the state is, and from the perspective of people actually working in organizations.
Absolutely. And Catalyst does an enormous amount of research globally each and every year. And one of our recent reports that just came out is focused on emotional tax. And so that is the weight that Intersectional employees, specifically racialized employees and more, are carrying to work every day, the pressure that they're feeling. And we have a huge issue in Canada. And if you're looking at the Canada-only stats out of the emotional tax report that we did, we're looking at 22% of our workplaces are made up by people of color. Within that group, we're seeing Canada has the 4th worst attrition rate, specifically for people of color. So this is shocking. This is problematic. We're seeing that it depends on what racialized group, but we're seeing between 50 and 69% of racialized employees feeling that weight of that emotional tax. And this gets higher and higher if you're looking at different levels of intersectionality. So for example, within the LGBTQ community, 85% of those that are trans and non-binary are feeling that emotional tax. So these numbers are off the charts in my view. They're significant and they need to be considered and taken seriously. So in terms of retaining racialized employees, and in terms of just ensuring that their daily lives are not heavy with that emotional tax, and we can't remove it completely, but there's a heck of a lot that we can do to improve the situation for those employees.
Can you just elaborate on the concept? I think people probably get it a little bit, but what do you mean by emotional tax?
Absolutely, thank you. I jumped right in and took that for granted. I'm sorry about that. So in terms of emotional tax, we're talking about the combination of feeling different from peers at work. And so this might be related to your gender, to your race, to your ethnicity, being on guard of bias on a regular basis when you go into the office or when you're working virtually, and the associated effects on your health, on your well-being, and frankly, just your ability to thrive. So this is how you're bringing your authentic self to work, and frankly, what you're not able to bring to work.
I'd love to sort of ask a follow-up to Kike, Krystal, or Michael. Are you seeing this as well? This notion, whether it's that language, emotional tax, or real impact that issues of racism, discrimination, inequity are having on people, and do senior leaders understand this? Do they view this as a health and safety issue, the way they would other things?
I mean,
they do.
Oh, go ahead, Krystal, and then we'll go to Kike as well.
Okay, I'll be quick, but I think they do. We're seeing more and more leaders expressing when we're seeing injustices in community and external environments, more so than we ever did, I think, in the past, and not just happening externally, but also internally with their groups. And so again, that's a good, I think, indication that you can't necessarily be quiet or fear the risk associated with speaking out. We're seeing more and more that bravery and that courageousness coming out in our leaders, which again, I think is a good indication and sign.
Kike?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the leaders are having the conversation, but one of the things that is striking to us, so KOJO Institute, working with a number of spaces, both public and private sector leadership, but also mid-management and below, what I'm seeing is that certainly for Black staff in particular, actually, I see it across racialized groups. I'm going to talk about Black staff and then I'm going to make a comment about racialized staff. I see sort of two camps or two things happening predominantly for Black staff. One is complete silence and sort of like complete disassociation from the issues, even as they manage them daily. So it's quietly sort of managing head down, just working it through and saying nothing. There's the other group that is, I think, taking what they perceive as more risks and sort of, sort of having a keen awareness that it is risky behavior, that, you hear a lot of the organization isn't ready for this. When I'm coaching Black executives, I'll often say, don't leave like your identity behind. You were in most cases, you were hired because you were Black. And what I mean by that is not that they weren't excellent or weren't hired for being excellent, but that, the board or the leadership team that hired them sort of high-fived themselves for hiring a Black person. So make it count, and you see sort of Black people sort of struggling to And so what I mean by that is, not sort of in a stereotypical or trope-ish manner, but that they would speak out again about racism, speak about their own experiences. So you sort of see, Black staff really grappling with that. Among non-Black, non-Indigenous, non-white staff, the group that I will call here racialized, I find very interesting that, again, I find that there's more folks who want nothing to do with this conversation and sort of do this really like, that's not my thing. And I think there's a conversation that we need to have to really do this work really well about who's experiencing what and how your identity is valued socially, globally, globally, and the meaning that gets attached to your identity, how that changes your day-to-day experience, and I think informs the degree to which you see yourself as an activist in relation to the issues. So what I'm saying is, for Black people where there's anti-Black racism targeting them and sort of an ever-present and constant reality, and for being seen as the racial other, sort of the most other of the racial others kind of thing, and then you see it phenotypically, hair, texture, everything, right? That I think that they're often struggling because it's like, I can't ignore this even if I want to. Right. Whereas I think for some groups, there's an attempt to ignore it, although it harms them in the end, but I think that they can kind of get further with the ignoring. So, and so I'm struggling with the celebration of how we're doing because right. There's a lot of people coping in ways that aren't helpful to progress.
Well, I think what you described sounds like even when it's a quote unquote, a good thing, a more than deserving Black leader gets promoted to a senior executive position, just being that Black leader in that example is a huge burden for all the reasons that you described. And it's one that if you're not, you wouldn't face in the same way, if at all, in the case of someone like me. Let's go. I want to go to this other side of the coin, I guess, which is, yes, we should be pleased that there's good intention and that there's investment and that there's language and discussion. But I know you all are very keen to talk about what needs to change. I'd start the question with, I guess, a fairly broad one. So feel free to take it anyway. And I'll go to you, Michael. With all this attention, investment, focus, discussion, we still have a long way to go. What are we getting wrong? What needs to change? Michael, go ahead and kick us off on the what do we got to do different conversation.
How long do we have? So I think one of the, just following on what Krystal and Kike said, one of the biggest issues that I see is that a lot of employers have focused on the diversity and not on the inclusion. And so they've, I talked to so many employers who say, oh, we need to hire more diverse people. And of course, that's code for people of color. And they're bent on hiring people, but they don't understand that their workplace is not inclusive. They see people of color, Black, let's talk about Black people. They see Black people coming in the door and other people are looking at them and saying, well, there's a diversity hire. So they're not doing enough to make sure that the environment that we're sending people into is one where they can succeed. We're setting people up for failure. I use the analogy of a garden. When you plant a seed and it doesn't grow, you don't blame the seed. The problem is the soil. In the analogy, diversity is the seed and the soil is inclusion. And I think employers are really bent on that diversification, which is important. Representation matters. If I can't see it, I can't be it. But if you're sending me into an environment where I'm going to face anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, you name it, I'm out. I'm not sticking around. And nobody, people will either leave or they will stay. And to Kike's point, they will put their head down and they will just try to survive. And that isn't helping anyone.
And let me I'll follow up right to you, Michael, before I'll go to Julie next. That's I think an excellent assessment of the issue. How do we change that? Or how do leaders in these institutions, I guess, change the soil, to extend the analogy?
Well, you have to understand the difference of experience. And I think a lot of people, particularly leadership, have a bit of a naive view of what's going on in their organizations, that they don't, they think that they're hired good people and racism doesn't exist. And, that's just unrealistic. They're naive about it. So they need to accept the reality that people's experiences are different. And then they need to make sure that they are educating everyone on what it means to be inclusive and everyone has a role to play inclusion. It's not one person. It's not a policy you can introduce. Every single person in the organization has the power to create an exclusionary environment, and thus they have the power to create an inclusionary environment. But it is an active role. And if you don't know what that looks like, then you can't play the role.
Julie, your thoughts here?
Yeah, 2 points. So one is around the performative nature of a lot of the leadership we're seeing. And frankly, the roots of a lot of DEI work has been quite performative. We've talked about celebrating days or acknowledging certain things. I can think of 10 years ago where everyone was asked to bring in a meal from their country of origin. Remember when we used to do that? And frankly, a lot of this work is performative. We're doing land acknowledgements where we don't understand what we're saying and we're not following up with meaningful action. We're mentioning George Floyd very often in speeches, but we're not actually doing something about it. This has been 3 years. It's not to be mentioned in speeches, it's to be acted upon. And frankly, when you talk about gender equity, as much as I have mixed emotions when men in particular talk about wanting gender equity because of their daughters, as happy as I am about that, we can't wait for every man to have a daughter to actually believe and want to make a change around gender equity. So as kind as that is in terms of how it sounds, it does end up being quite performative in the end. And if you look at what organizations who are serious about driving change, we don't have a day to celebrate sales when we want to increase sales in an organization. You don't have a day to celebrate it. You actually have a plan, you have a strategy, you give resources to this, and you make it a part of your core strategic plan. And this is really what we need to be seeing around DEI work and what frankly is not happening and what employees are calling out. And the second part of that is around the discomfort of these discussions. These are hard discussions. These aren't feel-good discussions. These are really uncomfortable discussions. They're about calling in and teaching, but they're also about calling out sometimes when what's going on is not appropriate. And I think that's when CEOs and frankly, when HR offices get a little bit uncomfortable because these are difficult things and there's issues that are being raised that doesn't make everybody feel good and celebrating a diversity in an organization. And so we have to be comfortable and we have to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations to actually advance change. So while we talk about safe spaces, we need these safe spaces to be safe and also courageous. We need them to be real and we need them to be meaningful and we need them to lead somewhere beyond the safe spaces.
Krystal?
Julie, that was a lot of great points. So again, I agree. I was going to say a couple of those myself. The one thing I'll add is that when I'm thinking about what can we change or what we can look at is when you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, most times, if we're looking at the data and the numbers, they're telling us that racialized groups are falling into the lower levels of the organization. And so, back to Michael's point around, everyone is trying to recruit and hire more racialized groups. But again, we're not seeing a concentrated effort of trying to fill leadership positions. What message is that telling any organization when you have 100 people in your organization and you have, when you go up to the top of the house, it's obsolete. You see no racialized groups there. And so again, that's kind of the pain point. I think, we're constantly seeing that revolving door effect with talent. The organizations, Julie, to your point, that are doing it well actually start to show that it is very equitable at all levels. And so when your organization can start to show that, that's really when you're walking the walk and talking the talk.
Kike?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about this idea about inclusion. And one of the things that I think that, again, if we, in an effort to make this conversation very real and different, I think we have to start to trouble language. And who decided that that these words should even be the goal. I want to say that, in our practice, we've been around for 24 years in March. Our practice is to talk about getting to equity, getting to equitable outcomes, and that frameworks like diversity inclusion, are just two frameworks to get there. But we need to start talking about anti-racism and anti-oppression. One of the things about inclusion is it really says, make sure that those diverse bodies are around the key tables, the decision-making tables, the C-suite, et cetera, that they're included. But that doesn't automatically disrupt the problematic and powerful but unexamined ideas about them that then follow them into the boardroom and follow them into the decision-making table. And so this is where anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-oppression work comes in. So I wanted to make sure we tabled that. But the second thing, even as Julie talks about, we have to start having courageous conversations, that's reminding me of some work we do around, the culture shift of the organization, right? So should it be courageous? Right? Should it require courage different than other things require, whatever they require, right? Should it be courage that it requires? And that we start to think about the cultures we create and reproduce in our corporations and institutions right now today. And when we say or culture, that we think very simply, what do we value? Well, how do you know what you value? Well, what do you reward and what do you consequence? So are people rewarded for raising these issues? We do a proclamation, we do a policy, we put it in the strat plan, we talk about it at the town hall and the all staff, et cetera. And then when people lean in, i.e., raise the racist thing, raise the heteronormative thing, raise the sexist thing, whatever it is that they're doing, we clutch our pearls and go, oh, now, why are you saying, all right? And we don't reward it. And then we ask ourselves why change isn't afoot. So that change will come when the organizational cultures reward the leaning into this thing that we have said is so important to us. So, for me, it's about the culture shift. And I think that will provide the context, the soil, the tilling of the soil that Michael talks about will be helped through that process.
Great discussion from everybody. That's fantastic. I got some questions from the audience, and this one links directly. And I think you were starting to head there, Kike, but I'm happy to see if anyone wants to start. Someone said, hey, can you talk about some meaningful practices here? And I think that's what part of today is about, is hopefully helping what I genuinely believe in most cases are good intentions across the board, but turn it into action that matters versus things that, while there's been some positive effect, to your point, Kike, the equitable outcomes have in most cases not been achieved. What are some specifics? Does anyone want to take this question first?
I mean, I can take
Go ahead, Krystal. Yeah, please.
A quick one. And I just want to bounce off an idea too, really quickly around language. I just want everyone here today to realize that language is ever changing, ever evolving. And it's very clear to groups when an organization is very progressive in their language and when they haven't taken the time to really look at that. And so that goes into all of your messaging, marketing, your comps teams, anyone has any responsibility really in communications to really make sure that we're on top of language. And I think about an example of Native, Aboriginal, Indigenous peoples, and capitalizing the I and putting an S at the end of that. Following UNDRIP report and what is the correct terminology, very, very important. So I just want to make sure that I got that point across. In terms of practices, what I've seen, this is very specific to the Indigenous peoples area focus, but is having Indigenous advisory committees and advising at the highest levels. That means the CEO and their ELT teams, for instance. I've seen a lot of organizations start to take on this practice, and I think it's something that if your organization hasn't done that as of yet, it's something to definitely look into.
Awesome. Anyone else want to weigh in on this sort of specific? Sorry, Julie, and then Michael.
Absolutely. So 2 concrete ideas here in terms of the questions from the audience. So my specific area of research is around university leadership. And I'm sure many of us noticed that Harvard University just hired a Black woman as their president. And I'm sure a lot of people were very happy about that, but I don't think they realize the I don't know, 30 years of work that went behind that selection process in terms of representation, in terms of hanging up portraits of other women amongst all the white former university presidents that had existed, really tangible work that they've done that I admire a lot. And one of the concrete things they do is they have something called culture carriers. So these are trained individuals that will walk into a board meeting, that will walk into an executive meeting, and will report back at the end of those meetings. And so in a Senate meeting, let's say, at the end of the meeting, they'll say, do you realize that men spoke 80% of the meeting? Do you realize that this racialized woman was cut off when she said an idea and it wasn't acknowledged? Do you realize that this idea that was accepted by a white man was actually presented 20 minutes earlier in the meeting by such and such? And so this really tangible objective, we're not asking somebody at the meeting to carry the weight of that or to say, hey, you just cut me off. We're actually having somebody that has this role that does not have a power structure within the institution and is actually reporting back. So when people look at Harvard University and say, oh, wow, they're so lucky, they're Harvard, they have this amazing Black woman as their leader, it was strategic, it was focused, it was set on a very, very, very concrete plan that led to that. And a second part, just to applaud something that Catalyst has done, we've just launched Catalyst CEO Champions for Change initiative. And this is specific representation for the organization, for the leadership in terms of representation of not only women, but racialized women on the board and on the executive of corporations globally. We have 80 CEOs that are currently signed up, and we just came out with a report. And when you're looking specifically at that group of leaders who have gone that far and made that commitment in terms of representation, we're seeing that they're doing better in terms of pay equity, in terms of board accountability, and in terms of actual representation. So by the fact of them, I know that a lot of us question different pledges and things that people sign up for in terms of making that commitment to data, to metrics, and to representation in their organizations. We're actually seeing that compared to their global counterparts, they're doing much better and they're outpacing their colleagues.
Other thoughts on this question? I thought it was a great couple of points. Julie, anyone else want to weigh in here?
Sure, I'll jump in. Or Kike, you go ahead, please.
No, I was waiting on you.
Okay. Yeah, so there's 1,000 best practices I could mention, but there's two things that immediately come to mind. One is around education. And I'm going to say this and then I'm going to contradict myself. Education is an incredibly important part, as I'm apt to do. Education is an incredibly important part of an organization's journey around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. People don't know what they don't know. We cannot expect people, because it's 2023, to have the knowledge around what it means to be inclusive. However, there's a recent article in the New York Times that basically said that diversity training is not only ineffective, it's actually contradictory and causing more damage. I believe that any sort of diversity and inclusion training needs to be experiential. It needs to engage the learner in a way that shows them it happens. And I often use the example of Black women's hair. When I'm giving a presentation, I'll ask a question, how many of you have ever had a person touch your hair without asking? And occasionally there'll be a few hands go up. All of the Black women will raise their hand. Scott and I will not raise our hands, largely because neither of us has much hair to touch. But I can tell you without asking the question that Kike has had this happen to her probably on a daily basis. Until you see it, you don't know what's really happening. I can tell you the theory of unconscious bias, but until you see it, you don't know it. It's why the video of George Floyd, may he rest in power, had such an impact. Believe it or not, he was not the first Black man to have been killed by police that month, let alone that year or ever. But it was that video that we saw that we couldn't turn away. So learning has to be experiential. The second thing I would say as a leading practice is diversity is not a program. It's not something you tuck over on the side. It layers over everything you do as an organization. Yes, your talent practices, who you hire, who you retain, who you promote. There should be an inclusion and diversity lens applied to that. But what about your customers, your marketing, your suppliers, your real estate, your technology? It needs to integrate into everything organizations do. And when it's considered to be a standalone project or program, then oftentimes when there's, I don't know, a recession and interest is at 4.5%, diversity's out the door. But when it's integrated into everything you do as an organization, and I would argue that TD does a very good job of this, not to toot your horn, but when it's integrated into the organization, into everything you do, budget cuts aren't part of the conversation because it just is seen as so important and integral to what you do.
Kike?
Yeah, yes to so much of what my colleagues are saying. I think that this idea of education is so important, but I think that there's a framework of things that need to be sort of that need to come with it, right? So we have a framework we use called PEAK, and it's a play on peak interest, peak of the mountain kind of thing, and it's PEEC, and I'm going to just share it with y'all real quick. The P is for policy or proclamations. So what is your C-suite saying about this, and then expecting at every level all the way down? What are they saying about it? Where are they saying it? How consistently, et cetera, and what does the policy say and include? The first E is for education. To Michael's point, people don't know what they don't know. We level set with language. We ensure that people know what we're talking about, and understand the policy and the policy directives. The second E, there's three. The second E is establish targets. So what are your issues? So, and this is a really common thing we find in our practice. People will call us and say, we need DEI. And I'll say, why? And I'll say, George Floyd was murdered. Okay, so what is going on inside of your organization that represents the inequities that you want to do work about? You need to know what they are. You need to have a sense. You don't have to know definitively. You don't have to have all the data, but you have to know this is going on, this is going on, this is going on, and then establish targets therein, right? After you're educated. This third E is enforcement. So you've established your targets. You need to be tracking, monitoring, reporting, evaluating your progress, people, through performance management, there needs to be a so what about this work. And in relation to that, and lastly is C, which is correction and consequences. It should matter whether you've leaned into this or not. It should cost you to not lean in. And when I say lean in, I mean that in all the ways you can think of. It should cost you if your department did the least amount of activity, et cetera, or worst outcomes. It should cost you something. So that's correction and consequences. And that is sort of our sort of holistic framework, which we help you with and help you to figure out. But just to say that this has many bits. And when we talk about best practices, I mean, there's a whole lot in each of those, but I just wanted to give people just a sense of a way forward about this.
And are people stopping, Kike, at the sort of declaration at the beginning? Like is that kind of the root cause issue? I say big statements, I set big goals, maybe even I declare, zero tolerance for racism, but that's it.
But what it is, Scott, is it's the tango between policy proclamations and education. And organizations will dance between those two and never get past Not go further. And if somebody does something really egregious, what do? They go for training, right? Yeah. And so we do this education dance, policy education, all for years, for decades, and then scratch our heads. Why isn't anything changing? Well, it needs the rest, just like we would do for any other system change. We know how to change systems. We have to apply it to this.
I got a couple. Oh, sorry, Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, just to support what Kike is saying, because I think it's just so powerful. And, we did a research study in November, 14,000 employees globally. 75% of those employees said that they don't actually believe the racial equity policies of their employer. So they basically say it's BS, it's words, it's actually not real and it's not meaningful. And frankly, that's more hurtful than anything, right? Like that's more, when you talk about emotional tax, when you don't believe the words of your employer, that affects your retention, that affects how you feel at work, that affects absolutely every part of your life. And so we have 75%. So even those of us who are, tapping ourselves on the shoulders and saying we're doing a good job, there's still so much more to do because that's a huge, huge number, right?
I think that's an extraordinary point, Julie, because I bet if you asked the leadership of those groups, they would, for them, it might not be 100, but I bet 75% would say, no, we're sincere in our commitment. And so the bridge that you described, Kike, or the spectrum, like clearly a big part of the issue is organizations are not going far enough along these lines. I have a couple of more questions from the audience, which I think are really good. I won't be able to get to them all, so apologies to anyone's question I don't get to. One of the things I think has been transparently a challenge at times inside our organization, I suspect it is in others, is people sort of groups together. People, what I've certainly learned, and I know I don't need to tell all of you, is people at different groups experience it differently and at different degrees of severity for all kinds of different reasons. But one specific question I want to ask you, because I thought was a good one, is often the discussion of equity, inclusion, DEI does focus on race, does focus on gender, and to some extent that's obviously it should. This person's question was, what about people with disability? I guess my question for you all is, do people with disabilities and the issues and discrimination and experiences they face, the emotional attacks they have, does it get enough attention? Is there something we should be doing differently for people with disabilities than we are today? Michael, do you want to take that one maybe?
Oh, I will happily take that one. As a person who lives with a disability, I specifically use the initialism idea or acronym idea: inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And why I started doing that is because after 17 years, I have watched as people with diverse abilities have notoriously been left out, whether that is in physical access to opportunities, psychological access, you name it. There is not enough attention being paid to people with diverse abilities. We say it is. It's in the Employment Equity Act. We have the Accessibility Canada Act coming, I think. But notoriously, employers will do things like when they're opening a new office, they're constructing a new office, they'll just rely on the building code. Well, the building code is woefully out of date and is not leading practice. So I absolutely agree with that. There isn't enough attention being paid. To the point, though, we treat people with diverse abilities as a monolith, just as we do with people of color, with the LGBTQ2+ communities, and we're not. The experience of a Black person compared to the experience of a light-skinned, say, Spanish person are vastly different, just as they are with people with diverse abilities. I live with diverse ability. It's invisible. I don't have mobility concerns. But if I am a wheelchair user, my world is very different there. So you can't treat any group as a monolith. You have to look at each individual person's experiences. And
I think you said this, Michael, but I'll amplify it. I think that's a good lesson for everybody who is, whether you're working in DI directly or, as was stated, we all should be, and it's part of everything we do. I think that's a big pitfall that organizations do fall in, is there are communities and there are issues that individual groups face that are similar but there are different issues, challenges, experiences that even within different communities, they're different, and I think we have to figure out as leaders and as organizations how to respect that.
Can I just add something, Scott?
Yeah, please, Kike. Yeah, go for it.
It's just to say, and I think Michael's alluding to it, or just said it frankly, which is this matter of intersectionality. Sometimes people will, in the face of race in particular, I find, particularly when race is raised, it's, yeah, but what about this group? And yeah, but what about that group? And I think that, one of the things that we need in order to ensure that we, get to equity and get to equitable outcomes is we need data, and we need, disaggregated identity-based data, and we need it about all things and in relation to all groups. So when we talk about people with diverse abilities or, so-called people with disabilities, we need to be thinking about the fact that people with disabilities are not it's not some monolithic box. And if you think of it as a monolithic box, close your eyes. What do you imagine them to look like? What color are they? What gender are they? And, et cetera, right? So what assumptions are you making about these monolithic identities? One of the things we were so struck by attending the Giants of Africa events, panel events a couple months ago, was the keynote speaker, Jarvis Sam, who is an out gay man, said, I have experienced more racism in the queer community than I've experienced homophobia in the Black community. This is an important data point. This is an important thing to understand and acknowledge. We can't just say LGBTQ as folks. We need to talk about the experience of intersectionally various LGBTQ as folks and what their experience, and then do that work. So this I feel like sometimes it's a bit of an attempt to kind of escape something. We can't escape it. We're all things, and we're intersectional.
Sorry, go ahead.
And Scott, I was just going to add to that really specifically when I think about the Indigenous population as well, similar to what Kike and Michael are saying, is that we're not a homogeneous group by any means. And so what happens is when you're thinking about, let's say, representation and a recruitment strategy, you're trying to cast a wide net when we're very, when you think about what a strategy looks like, you have 635 different communities with all varying ages across Canada. You have an urban Indigenous population, you have rural, and you have remote. And so again, does your strategy incorporate all of those differences? Because again, I think that's the piece where, the more specific you are, the better you'll be in really identifying what those gaps are and then narrowing that gap when you think about representation. So I wanted to point that out as well, because I think it's something that I see is that we're not homogeneous by any means. You have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples populations. And again, it's very, very diverse, even within that subgroup.
Yeah, and I think we probably won't have enough time to go deeper into that today, but I think you've all brought this up in one way or the other. And I think as organizations are thinking about their evolution, at least thinking, how do we address this? How do we understand this? I think is going to be something that's really important. Krystal, I do want to spend a bit of time I'll start with you on reconciliation. And I know it's a big question, but where are we particularly, for the institutions, the corporations most likely that are listening? How do we think about, talk about where we've come if you want, but I really want your view on where we've come or where we should be going as it relates to reconciliation. And again, I probably need to give you a half an hour to answer that question, I'm sure, because it's nuanced and complex, but I'd love to hear at least your headline view of it.
Yeah, for sure. It is a difficult question. And I think, the most correct answer I could give is it depends on the organization. Some have gone very far and very quick, and some have been very intentional. And I can't even group, let's say education institutions versus Bay Street organizations, big corporations, medium-sized, small organizations. But what I can say is that overall, I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I've seen in the last 2 years, radical change. I've seen lots of appointments in many industries. And so again, I think there's still an immense opportunity to do more in reconciliation. And again, the onus has to fall on, not just big corporations, but individually as Canadians as well, to take that time to re-educate ourselves on the true history of Canada, to really go further than we ever can if we just, we wait for an organization to teach us on an L&D once a year. It has to be, like Michael mentioned, experiential. And there are lots of opportunities to have those experiential learnings in your lifetime and in your children's lifetimes.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that topic? Feel free. If Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a topic that frankly really means a lot to me. This morning, I'm calling in from the unceded territory of the Lenape people in New York City, who were frankly violently displaced from New York City 400 years ago. And so, what are we each doing in our locations where we're calling in from today to understand the history of those territories and what that actually means? And what are we actually doing tangibly in our organizations to advance to action? And, we had a keynote speaker at our recent conference who ended up her remarks. Rose LeMay talking about the need to hire more Indigenous people. And, as Krystal was saying earlier, at senior levels, at important decision-making levels, and not simply, scattered throughout the organization or simply focusing in roles focusing on Indigenous relations. We want First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to be working in our organizations in influential roles and really making a difference. So there's so much. I see this is two very different discussions. I think there's DEI strategies, and I think there's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis strategies. Organizations need to have one of each, and they need to have a very concrete plan moving forward for each.
Great. Let's see here. Let me go to one more from the audience. The government of Canada has talked about a significant increase to immigration, something that I think further enriches the diversity of Canada, will bring people of all different backgrounds, including folks who are intersectional. Are there anything leaders, businesses should be thinking about in advance of? I mean, this is a country of immigrants already, as well as obviously our settler and colonial past. But as we think about new immigration coming in, is there something to that? Is there anything we should be thinking about as institutional or business leaders? Go ahead, Kike.
I just want to talk about the announcement in itself, and the details. This is a conversation with Canadians about Canada. I don't know that we can talk about this without talking about this politeness, this pseudo politeness, an inability to have the real conversations. So who are we extending this immigration to? Most Canadians aren't even aware of the immigration policy process and, how our country came to look like this, the way it looks now even. And what I mean by that is the socioeconomic context for the groups that are here and the trajectories that are set up in relation to the rules of immigration. So, for example, the domestic program and the skilled laborer program that opened Canada up as an option for people coming from the Commonwealth, so the Caribbean, et cetera. You could come if you were a domestic. You could come if you were domestic and willing to leave your family behind. You could come these and when I say you could come, you got points in relation to your willingness to do it.
Right.
Or if you met a particular threshold, you get particular sets of points. So when we, so I think that for folks that have to interact with that because their families have been here for 200, 300 years, this conversation is very different. If you know it intimately, you know about the point system, you know how it's inequitably applied across the globe. So there are more points given in particular parts of the world where Canada wants to draw people from versus other parts. My comment is, look deeper into the policy. Who exactly is being invited in? Who are the doors being swung open for? And who are they remaining fairly shut tight for? And what you'll find is a very anti-Black policy, an anti-African policy, and that's been true and consistent for a lot of years. So I just, it's hard to have the conversation in this sort of shallow way. We have to get deep and complicated about immigration.
Yeah. That was a much better reframing of the question than the one I asked. So very much appreciate it. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, you and I feel like are two peas in a pod. I agree with you completely. And I had some significant issues with the policy and how they're approaching it. That said, we need immigration. Our birth rate is down. We're in population decline. Our unemployment is at an all-time low. There's good reasons why we need skilled labor in this country. Employers need to, I'm just going to say it, pull their heads out of their ass and figure out that people with experience from another country is just as valuable as people who got experience in this country. Just because you don't know what the Indian Institute of Technology is, doesn't mean it's not the hardest school on the planet to actually graduate from. We've got this thing about Canadian experience, and I've worked in countries all around the world have never seen this. But in Canada, we somehow think that this is the most important thing. And if we're going to be successful in integrating these immigrants, we cannot have them in survival jobs, not dissing survival jobs. Like, every Uber driver who's ever driven for me, thank you so much. But if you have a more education than I do and you're driving an Uber because you have no other choice, that's a big problem for me.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And Scott, if I may, we have to name how white supremacy is playing out in this.
Yeah.
And again, Canada, hello. If we want to go further and progress this, we have to be able to say white supremacy, not lose half the room, not have people clutch their pearls, not have people have an amygdala hijack. White supremacy is real. It's all around us. It is not the hoods, not solely hoods and Nazi symbols. It is systemic and and Canadian as beaver tails. The point is to say that the reason, to Michael's point, that that's happening is because of what ideas are behind the idea that, beyond Western Europe, which is seen as the site of knowledge, which is seen as what good Canadian values reflect, there is nothing else. It's just, a void and a gap of knowledge and awareness. Those are untrue, problematic, historically inaccurate white supremacist ideas. And that's what the root of them is. And we have to name that. We have to, through these trainings that we do, this education, we need to help people see how white supremacy is embedded in their thinking. It's not naturally occurring. It is well taught and well reproduced in Canada. And that's the first task of a good, I think, equity consultant, is attend to those things.
Excellent. We have time for one question. I'll go around and just ask everybody, what's your last, comment? I'll just be very broad about it. You have one more sort of message to give here. Julie, is it okay if I start with you? What's your last comment before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just simply say we've got to move beyond good intentions. It's great to have your heart in the right place, but you need to have your head in the right place, and there needs to be strategy, action, and you need to deliver. And that's from the top down of the organization.
Great. Krystal?
Yeah, you're all here because curiosity brought you here today to learn more about it, but don't let this be the last place where you end up. Keep being curious, and there's a lot of resources out there for you, including the panel here today.
Michael?
I would just say the package matters. Kike just said something very important and very powerful. And I would be willing to wager that there's some people on the call who felt very uncomfortable and didn't listen to her. The reality is that I am a white man. I'm gay, I'm gender nonconforming, and I live with a disability, but I'm still a white guy. And I would say to all my fellow white men on this call, use your power. Step up and use your power to help ensure that people like Kike and Krystal and Julie are heard, because there's a lot of power that comes with the package you're in.
And Kike, I give you the last word.
Well said, everyone. Accountability. And that's where that correction, that enforcement, correction, and consequences lies. That's the turning point for us. We're so close, Canada, to making real change and progress. We can do this. It's possible. We know how to change other things. We can change this. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Kike, Julie, Krystal, Michael. This has been, I think, an awesome and extraordinary conversation. I think, the good news is we've got the right intentions. We actually have the investment. We have the work in place. I think we got some good guidance here on how to roll up our sleeves and perhaps shift where and how we put our attention. I know this wasn't the first and won't be the last conversation on this topic, but a huge thank you to the panelists for your time. Gaurav, let me pass it back over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, that was amazing. Krystal, Michael, Julie, Kike, I thank you so much for taking the time to join us and sharing your experience and wisdom with everybody today. It's so good to hear about all the progress, even as there's so much to do. I was just really glad in some ways I was watching at home as I was able to take a lot of notes. Just a few of the takeaways for me, just the solid facts that Julie gave around emotional attacks and racialized and other equity deserving employees, which is also a term I thought Kike was awesome, because I know often I know they say equity seeking, but I think equity deserving is a much better one. The emotional tax on people can really be very heavy. Some of the advice around Krystal gave around Indigenous advisory committees, certainly I think that's a great way to kind of really think about how we can integrate, that kind of experience as we think about reconciliation. I thought Michael's, experience from being such a teacher in this space around diversity, shifting from diversity to inclusion and making sure training is experiential. I think that's a really good takeaway because I think we've all experienced some of that training, and I think you walk away not really sometimes absorbing it, and that was amazing. I think Kike's point about challenging ourselves to think about anti-racism and going beyond. I mean, there are underlying causes for a lot of these things. I think we all have a role in that. And I thought I appreciate how it came back on a couple of points, which to me were a bit personal, around the fact around immigrants. Both my parents came to the country as immigrants. They got in because of points, because of their success as engineers and teachers. But to be honest, they were never able to work as either. They ended up running a convenience store and a gas station and whatnot, but never able to really, use the skills that actually got them into the country. And I also want to just appreciate the audience. The questions, they were great. Again, as a person who walks with crutches since the age of 3, it's great somebody brought up the issue around personal sort of person with disability, and it was great the way it was handled and discussed, and just the discussion around intersectionality that it triggered. So just amazing discussion. I could listen to you guys for much longer if we had the time, but we're coming to a close. And Scott, thank you so much for your expert guidance. I mean, it's a challenging topic. You did a great job of guiding the conversation, so thank you so much. The Canadian Club's vision is to be the podium of choice for relevant, provocative conversations, connecting the business community and promoting an inclusive and prosperous Canada. We aim to achieve this vision at every event, and today was no exception. So thank you very much for being part of it. And quickly, a few upcoming events that people online may have an interest in. On Thursday, February 6th, Eric Martel from Bombardier will discuss their latest financial results and their commitment to Canadian defense. And on Tuesday, February 15th, we will hear from a dynamic panel of CEOs, including Victor Dodig from CIBC and Penny Wise from 3M, to discuss how we can secure Canada's immigration advantage. We hope you can join us in person or online for one or both. We have a lot of great events coming this winter and spring, so don't forget to keep checking canadianclub.org for information. Thank you again for TD for their support of today's important conversation. Thank you to our AV suppliers, Van Valkenburg Communications and livemeeting.ca, for making it possible for us to gather virtually today. And thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today, or perhaps you're taking the time to watch the playback of this event. We're glad you are here. Please stay healthy and safe. Thank you.